It was the kind of house that should have been forgotten long ago, standing in the center of an overgrown yard, hidden behind the thick veil of moss-covered trees. The kind of house that looked like it had a secret it desperately wanted to keep. At least, that's how Sarah had always felt about it. She had inherited it from her grandmother, a woman who had never been very forthcoming about the details of her past. All Sarah knew was that her grandmother had spent decades living in that house alone after the death of her husband. No one had visited, no one had been allowed to, and when Sarah was given the house, she felt a strange pull, a strange need to uncover whatever it was her grandmother had hidden away. The first time Sarah stepped inside, it felt like stepping into another time. The air was thick with dust, and the silence was oppressive. She had never been inside before, not even as a child, despite having visited her grandmother many times. Something about the place had always felt wrong. But now, as Sarah stood in the dim hallway, the creaking of the old wooden floorboards under her feet seemed to echo like a warning. The house was old, too old, and though its walls were sturdy, they seemed to whisper secrets. The air had a faint smell of decay, a combination of mothballs and something else Sarah couldn't quite place. It made her uneasy, but she pressed on. Her grandmother had lived here for decades, and though the house seemed abandoned now, there were memories to be uncovered. Upstairs, the hallway was narrow, with thick carpeting that had been worn down in places, revealing the wooden boards beneath. There were 3 rooms, but it was the door at the end of the hall that caught Sarah's attention. It was a small, unremarkable door, tucked away behind a faded tapestry, leading to what could only be the attic. The door was locked, a rusted key still hanging in the air next to it, seemingly untouched for years. That door had always been locked. Even as a child, Sarah had wondered what lay behind it. The attic door was the one thing her grandmother had never let her near. Sarah had often heard the creaking and groaning of the house at night, but the sounds always seemed to come from above. She had never dared to ask about the attic. It was just one of those things that was never spoken of. But now, standing before it as an adult, Sarah couldn't resist. She took the key from its hook and slid it into the lock. The door creaked open, and a gust of musty air hit her in the face, as though the attic had been holding its breath for years. The room beyond was dark, the only light filtering in from a small window high up on the far wall. Dust particles danced in the beams of light, and the floorboards creaked as she stepped inside. The attic was sparsely furnished, with only a few old trunks, crates, and a large sheet-covered object in a corner. A faint, almost imperceptible sound echoed through the space, a creaking noise, as if something were shifting, moving, though there was no sign of life. Sarah's heart began to pound in her chest as she carefully moved further into the room. The sound of her own footsteps echoed around her, amplifying the eerie silence. Suddenly, there was another creak, louder this time, followed by a soft, dragging sound. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and her breath quickened. She spun around, trying to locate the source of the noise, but there was nothing. Nothing except the oppressive stillness of the attic. Her mind raced. Maybe it was just the house settling, she thought. After all, it was old, and the wood had been exposed to years of humidity. But there was something about the creak, the way it sounded, something unnerving about it. It wasn't just the house settling. It was deliberate. She hesitated, her hand still gripping the door handle, when the creak came again. Closer this time, as though something or someone was shifting in the corner of the room. Heart hammering in her chest, Sarah turned toward the covered object. It was large, about the size of a person, and the sheet draped over it seemed to move ever so slightly, as though stirred by an unseen hand. Her curiosity got the best of her, and she approached cautiously. Every step seemed to make the creaking floorboards echo louder, amplifying the sensation that something was watching her. With trembling hands, she reached for the sheet and yanked it off. The sight that greeted her was enough to make her freeze. It was a rocking chair, old and weathered, its wood dark with age. But it wasn't the chair itself that made Sarah's blood run cold. It was the footprints that trailed behind it, dark, wet, and shaped like a person had walked in them, though there was no one there. The footprints led to the far wall, where an old, tarnished mirror hung crookedly. The glass was smudged, reflecting only darkness. But as Sarah stared at the mirror, she noticed something she hadn't before. Behind her, faintly reflected in the glass, was a figure, a shadowy shape standing in the corner of the room. The figure was still, unmoving, and yet the air around it seemed to pulse with an eerie energy. The sound of breathing, slow and heavy, began to fill her ears. "Hello," Sarah called out, her voice shaking as she slowly turned around. But when she faced the corner, there was nothing there. The air was thick with a strange, suffocating tension. Then, just as quickly as the sensation had come, it vanished. Her pulse raced as she backed away, trying to make sense of what was happening. But as she turned to leave the attic, the door slammed shut with a force that shook the house. The darkness in the room seemed to close in around her, and the creaking began again, this time louder, more insistent. A voice, soft but unmistakable, whispered in her ear, so close that she could feel its chill breath. "You shouldn't have come here." In a panic, Sarah scrambled to the door, her heart thundering in her chest. But the door refused to open. It rattled violently in its frame, as though something was on the other side, preventing her from escaping. The air in the attic grew cold, unnaturally cold, as the creaking turned into something else, something more rhythmic. It was as if the walls themselves were alive, the floorboards groaning beneath her feet, and the darkness deepening with every second. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the door sprang open. Sarah didn't look back. She bolted down the stairs, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She didn't stop until she was safely outside, standing in the overgrown yard, the night air cool against her flushed skin. As she looked up at the house, she saw it, through the cracked windows of the attic, the faintest silhouette of a figure standing motionless in the shadows. The rocking chair moved slowly back and forth, creaking in time with the eerie silence of the night. Sarah never returned to the house after that night, and as the years passed, the house stood still, its secrets locked away behind walls that creaked and groaned, as if to warn anyone who dared enter. But those who passed by in the quiet of the night would often hear it, the sound of footsteps on the stairs, soft and deliberate, just before dawn. And then the creaking would stop,